Baron Millionaire visits orphanage. Looking for an heir, but upon arrival, finds a young man identical to his deceased son. The powerful American businessman, Richard Montgomery, was returning from a business dinner with his wife, Carol, and their 8-year-old son, Matthew. The rain was pouring heavily over New York City, making visibility on the road difficult. Richard drove cautiously, aware of the responsibility he carried. Carol, sitting beside him, smiled sweetly as she caressed his hand. In the back seat, Matthew slept soundly, exhausted after a long day of games and laughter. Suddenly, a truck appeared out of nowhere, veering into their lane. Richard tried to swerve, but the wet pavement caused the car to skid. The last thing he remembered was the deafening sound of twisting metal and Carol's desperate screams. When Richard woke up in the hospital 3 days later, his world had collapsed. He was informed that Carol had died instantly and that Matthew had gone missing. Authorities had combed the area of the accident for days, but had found no trace of the boy. Devastated by the loss and consumed by guilt, Richard sank into a deep depression. He spent his days locked away in his mansion, refusing to see anyone, not even his younger brother Robert, who insisted on helping him overcome the tragedy. Weeks after the accident, Richard received another devastating piece of news. Due to the injuries he had sustained, he was now sterile. The possibility of ever becoming a father again had vanished forever. It was then that Richard made a decision that would change the course of his life. If fate had taken his family from him, he would dedicate the rest of his days to helping those who needed it most. He began donating large sums of money to charitable causes, building schools and hospitals in the poorest communities of the United States. However, the void in his heart remained. Richard longed for an heir, someone to whom he could pass on not only his fortune, but also his values and his passion for helping others. That was how he began visiting orphanages, hoping to find a child who could fill that void. What Richard didn't know was that fate had a surprise in store for him that would change his life forever. 15 years had passed since that fateful accident. Richard Montgomery, now 55 years old, had become a respected and admired philanthropist throughout the United States. His hair, once as black as ebony, now bore silver streaks that gave him an air of wisdom. His eyes, though tired, shone with determination every time he visited one of the charitable projects he had founded. On a hot summer afternoon, Richard arrived at the Hope and Life Orphanage on the outskirts of New York City. It was his 4th visit to an orphanage that month, part of his tireless search for an heir who could continue his legacy. As he walked down the hallways of the building, something caught his attention. A young man of about 23 years old was sitting on the floor, surrounded by small children who listened attentively as he read them a story. The scene moved Richard, who stopped to observe the young man, named Alex, had brown hair and green eyes that radiated kindness. His voice was soft but firm, and he gestured enthusiastically as he narrated the adventures of the characters in the book. Intrigued, Richard approached the orphanage director, Mrs. Johnson, a woman in her 60s with a kind smile and eyes full of compassion. "Who is that young man?" Richard asked, unable to take his eyes off Alex. Mrs. Johnson smiled proudly. "Ah, that's Alex. He arrived here 15 years ago as just a child. We never knew where he came from or who his parents were, but from the first day he showed that he was special, always helping the little ones, always with a smile despite the difficulties." Richard felt an inexplicable connection to Alex. There was something in his gaze, in his way of interacting with the children, that felt familiar and comforting. "And does he work here now?" Richard inquired. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery. When he turned 18, he insisted on staying as a volunteer. He studies social work in the mornings and comes here in the afternoons to help. He says this place is his home, and he wants to give back some of what he received." Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in Richard's mind. Without knowing why, he felt the urge to learn more about this special young man. "I'd like to speak with him if possible," Richard said. Mrs. Johnson nodded and called Alex. The young man approached with a shy smile, wiping his hands on the worn pants he was wearing. "Alex, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. Richard Montgomery. He's an important businessman and philanthropist who's visiting us today. Alex extended his hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Montgomery. I've heard about you and all that you do for the community. It's an honor to meet you. When their hands clasped, Richard felt an electric current run through his body. Alex's green eyes, so similar to Carol's, looked at him with a mix of respect and curiosity. "The honor is mine, Alex," Richard responded, trying to maintain his composure. "I've heard about your dedication to this place. It's admirable to see someone so young with such commitment." Alex blushed slightly. "I'm just trying to give back some of what I've received, sir. This place gave me a home when I needed it most." Richard couldn't help but think of his own lost son. Would Matthew have had the same noble spirit if he had survived? The thought brought a lump to his throat. "I'd like to hear more about your story, Alex. Do you have time to chat a bit?" Richard asked, surprising even himself with the interest he felt. Alex looked at Mrs. Johnson, who nodded with a smile. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. It would be my pleasure." As they walked away to find a quiet place to talk, neither of them could imagine how that simple conversation would change their lives forever. Fate, which had once separated them, was now silently working to bring them back together. As Richard and Alex talked, the businessman found himself increasingly intrigued by the young man. There was something in his manner of speaking, in his gestures, that felt strangely familiar. Alex told him about his life in the orphanage, his studies, and his dreams of helping other children in situations of abandonment. "And you never knew anything about your biological family?" Richard asked cautiously. Alex shook his head. "No, Mr. Montgomery. All I know is that I was found near here, injured and confused. I had some bruises and didn't remember anything about my past. The doctors said it was probably due to the trauma of the accident." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. "Accident? What accident?" "I'm not sure of the details," Alex replied, "but from what I was told, it seemed like I had been in a car accident. I had cuts and bruises consistent with that, but nothing more was ever known. No one claimed me, and over time this place became my home." Richard's mind raced. The dates matched. Alex's age, the accident. Could it be possible? Could this young man be his son Matthew? Trying to stay calm, Richard decided to investigate further. "Alex, would you mind if I hired someone to investigate your past? Maybe we could find some clues about your family." Alex looked at him in surprise. "Would you do that for me, Mr. Montgomery? But why?" Richard smiled sadly. "Let's just say your story has moved me, and maybe I can help you find answers." What Richard didn't know was that someone else was interested in Alex's past. Robert Montgomery, Richard's younger brother, had been watching the situation from the shadows. Robert had always envied his brother's success and fortune. When he learned that Richard was looking for an heir, he saw the perfect opportunity to seize the family fortune. He had been following Richard's steps, waiting for the right moment to act. That same night, as Richard prepared for bed, he received a call from Robert. "Brother, I've heard you've been visiting orphanages looking for an heir, perhaps?" Robert asked in a seemingly casual tone. Richard, always cautious with his brother, responded evasively, "I'm just trying to help, Robert. You know how important that is to me." Of course, Robert said. "I was just wondering if you had considered adoption. It could be a good option for you." Richard felt that something didn't quite fit with his brother's sudden interest. "I'll think about it, thanks for the suggestion." After hanging up, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was up to something. He decided that he would have to be even more careful in his investigation of Alex. Meanwhile, in his luxurious apartment, Robert smiled maliciously. He knew more than he let on 15 years ago. It had been him who had tried to kidnap Matthew after the accident, intending to use him to blackmail Richard. But his plan had gone awry when a nurse, a witness to the attempted kidnapping, had rescued the boy and taken him to the orphanage for protection. Robert had kept an eye on Alex all these years, waiting for the right moment to use him to his advantage. "Soon, dear brother," he murmured to himself. "Soon you'll discover the truth, but it will be too late. The Montgomery fortune will be mine." What Robert didn't know was that his plan had a critical flaw. An even bigger secret was about to come to light, a secret that would change the destiny of the entire Montgomery family. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Richard. He had hired the best private investigator in New York, John Carson, to delve into Alex's past. While he awaited news, Richard couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that this young man was his lost son. Alex, for his part, continued with his routine at the orphanage, unaware of the storm that was about to unfold. However, he noticed that something had changed. Mr. Montgomery visited him more often, always with a look of longing and hope that Alex couldn't quite understand. One afternoon, while Alex was playing with the children in the orphanage's courtyard, he noticed a man watching him from the street. It was Robert Montgomery, though Alex didn't know him. Intrigued and a bit alarmed, he approached the fence. "Can I help you with something, sir?" Alex asked cautiously. Robert smiled with false kindness. "I was just admiring the good work you're doing here. I'm Robert Montgomery, Richard's brother. I've heard you've become friends with my brother." Alex nodded, still wary. "Mr. Montgomery has been very kind to me. Are you also interested in helping the orphanage?" "Oh, of course," Robert replied with a calculating glint in his eyes. "In fact, I was wondering if we could talk in private. I have a proposal that might interest you." Before Alex could respond, Mrs. Johnson's voice called from the entrance. "Alex, Mr. Richard is here to see you." Robert cursed internally. "Another time, young man. Take care." As Robert walked away, Richard arrived with a concerned expression on his face. He had seen his brother talking to Alex, and it deeply unsettled him. "Alex, what did my brother want?" Richard asked, trying to hide his worry. Alex, confused by the tension in Richard's voice, answered cautiously, "He just introduced himself and said he wanted to talk to me in private. He mentioned something about a proposal." Richard frowned. He knew his brother too well to know that his intentions were rarely selfless. "Alex, I ask that you be careful with Robert. He's not someone you can fully trust." The young man nodded, intrigued by the warning. "I understand, Mr. Montgomery. But can I ask why? He's your brother, after all." Richard sighed deeply. "It's a long story, Alex. Maybe I'll tell you someday. For now, just promise me you'll be cautious." "I promise," Alex replied, growing more curious about the secrets that seemed to surround the Montgomery family. Meanwhile, John Carson, the private investigator, was working tirelessly to unravel the mystery of Alex's past. He scoured old hospital records, interviewed former orphanage employees, and followed every lead, no matter how small. One night, while reviewing old police reports, John made a surprising discovery. He found a report about an attempted kidnapping the night of the Montgomery accident. The report mentioned a nurse who had intervened to save an injured child from a man who was trying to take him away. Excited by the find, John quickly contacted Richard. "Mr. Montgomery, I think I've found something important. I need to see you immediately." Richard, who had barely been able to sleep in recent weeks, agreed to meet John in his office that very night. As he waited, his mind kept spinning. Could it be possible that after so many years, he had finally found his son? When John arrived and showed him the report, Richard felt like the world had stopped. "Are you sure about this, John? Do you think that boy could be—" "I can't be 100% sure, Mr. Montgomery," John replied cautiously, "but the dates match, and the description of the boy fits what we know about Alex Plus. I've been investigating that nurse. Her name is Mary Gomez, and interestingly, she left the hospital shortly after the incident. I've managed to locate her. She lives in a small town outside the city." Richard stood up from his chair, determined. "We have to talk to her, John. I need to know the truth." "There's something else, Mr. Montgomery," John added gravely. "The report mentions that the man who tried to kidnap the boy was described as someone who looked a lot like you, given that you were unconscious in the hospital at the time." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Robert," he murmured. "It must have been Robert." The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the gut. His own brother had tried to kidnap Matthew. Why? What did he hope to gain from it? And if Alex was really Matthew, what would Robert do now that Richard was close to discovering the truth? "John, I need you to keep investigating Robert. Find out everything you can about his movements in the past 15 years. I'm going to talk to Mary Gomez. And please keep an eye on Alex. I have a feeling that Robert won't stop at anything to achieve whatever he's planning." As Richard prepared to face the truth about the past, he couldn't imagine that an even bigger secret was about to come to light. A secret that would not only change his life, but would shake the foundations of everything he believed he knew about that tragic night 15 years ago. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when Richard Montgomery arrived in the small town where Mary Gomez lived. His heart pounded as he approached the modest home of the former nurse. Every step brought him closer to a truth that could change his life forever. Mary Gomez, a woman in her 60s with grey hair and kind but tired eyes, opened the door. Upon seeing Richard, her face paled as if she had seen a ghost. "Mrs. Gomez," Richard began with a trembling voice. "I know this may seem strange, but I need to talk to you about something that happened 15 years ago." Mary stared at him for a moment before slowly nodding. "I've been expecting this day for a long time. Mr. Montgomery, please, come in." Once inside, Mary offered Richard a cup of coffee and sat across from him with a solemn expression. "I suppose you're here about the boy," she said quietly. Richard nodded, unable to find the right words. Mary took a deep breath before beginning her story. "That night I was on duty at the hospital when they brought you and your family in. It was a terrible scene. You were unconscious, your wife." Mary hesitated, as if unsure whether to continue. "My wife died," Richard said, his voice breaking. Mary looked at him with a mix of compassion and guilt. "Mr. Montgomery, there's something you need to know. Your wife didn't die that night." Richard felt the world stop. "What? But they told me, everyone told me that Carol died in the accident." Mary shook her head. "She was very badly injured, yes, but she survived. However, she was in a deep coma. That's when your brother, Robert, appeared." Richard's mind was spinning as he tried to process this information. "Carol alive? Robert involved? Please, go on," he managed to say. "Robert arrived shortly after you. He seemed agitated. When he found out that your wife had survived, he panicked. I overheard him talking on the phone, saying that the plan hadn't gone as expected. Then I saw him trying to take the boy." Richard clenched his fists, anger and confusion battling within him. "What did you do?" "I intervened," Mary replied firmly. "I couldn't let him take the boy. I managed to wrestle him away and fled with him. Robert chased me, but I managed to lose him. I knew the boy wouldn't be safe if I returned him to the hospital, so I took him to the Hope and Life orphanage I told them I had, found him abandoned." "Alex," Richard murmured. "That boy was Alex, my Matthew." Mary nodded. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery, but there's more, your wife. Carol. Robert had her transferred to a private hospital under a false name. He said it was to protect her, but I knew something wasn't right. After that, I resigned from the hospital. Fear kept me silent for all these years, but I never stopped watching over Alex from a distance." Richard stood up abruptly, overwhelmed by the revelations. "Are you saying that Carol could be alive? Where? In what hospital?" Mary pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket. "Here's the address of the hospital and the false name under which she was registered. Mr. Montgomery, I know I made a terrible mistake by keeping silent for so long, but I hope you can forgive me. I just wanted to protect the boy." Richard took the paper with trembling hands. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: joy at knowing his son was alive, fury at his brother, and a spark of hope at the possibility that Carol had also survived. "Thank you, Mary," he finally said. "Thank you for saving my son and for telling me the truth. Now I have to go. I have to find Carol and confront Robert." As Richard hurried out of Mary's house, he knew he was facing the most important battle of his life. He had to reunite his family and expose his brother's betrayal. But first, he needed confirmation. He needed to see Carol with his own eyes. With his heart racing, Richard headed towards the hospital where his wife was supposedly being held. What he didn't know was that Robert was already aware of his movements and was preparing to make his final move. The fate of the Montgomery family hung by a thread, and the next few hours would determine whether they would finally be reunited or if the secrets and lies of the past would separate them forever. Richard drove like a madman toward the private hospital, where Carol was supposedly being kept. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: hope, fear, anger, love. Everything was mixed in a vortex that threatened to consume him. Meanwhile, at the orphanage, Alex was feeling uneasy. The conversation with Robert and Richard's warning had left him with a sense of unease that he couldn't shake. He decided to go for a walk to clear his thoughts, unaware that this simple act would place him at the center of the storm that was about to break. Robert, for his part, had been informed by one of his contacts about Richard's visit to Mary Gomez. He knew that his time was running out and that he had to act quickly if he wanted to maintain control of the situation. At the hospital, Richard burst into the reception, the paper with the information Mary had given him crumpled in his fist. "I need to see a patient," he demanded, his voice trembling with emotion. "She's registered under the name of Mary Sanchez." The receptionist, surprised by Richard's intensity, typed the name into her computer. "I'm sorry, sir, but I need authorization to give out information about patients." Richard was about to insist when a familiar voice stopped him in his tracks. "He has my authorization." Richard turned slowly, unable to believe what his ears were hearing. There, standing in the hallway, supported by a walker but with eyes full of life, was Carol. "Carol," Richard whispered, tears streaming uncontrollably down his face. "You're alive. You're here." He rushed to her, embracing her carefully but with all the strength of his love contained for 15 long years. Carol returned the embrace, also crying. "Richard, my love," she said between sobs. Finally, you're here." While the couple reunited, Alex walked distractedly through the streets near the orphanage. Suddenly, a black car stopped abruptly beside him. The door opened, and Robert Montgomery stepped out. "Alex, what a coincidence finding you here," Robert said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I need you to come with me. There's something important I need to show you." Alex, remembering Richard's warning, took a step back. "I'm sorry, Mr. Montgomery, but I can't go with you." "I don't know you." Robert's smile faded. "You don't understand, boy. You don't have a choice." Before Alex could react, 2 men emerged from the car and grabbed him. Despite his struggles, they shoved him into the vehicle, which sped away. Back at the hospital, Richard and Carol had moved to a private room. Between tears and caresses, they caught up on the last 15 years. "How is this possible?" Richard asked. "They told me you had died in the accident." Carol shook her head. It was Robert who orchestrated everything." "The accident wasn't an accident, Richard. It was an attempted murder." Richard felt the blood freeze in his veins. "What are you saying, Carol?" "Robert wanted the company, your fortune. He knew you were too smart to fall into his traps, so he decided to eliminate you and your family. When we survived, he panicked. He kept me here, in an induced coma for years, making you believe that I had died." "But you woke up," Richard said, squeezing his wife's hand. Carol nodded. "A year ago. The doctors couldn't believe it, but Robert threatened me. He said that if I tried to contact you or reveal the truth, he would make sure something terrible happened to Matthew." "Matthew?" Richard murmured. "Carol, Matthew is alive. He's Alex, the young man from the orphanage I just found out." Carol's eyes filled with a mixture of joy and terror. "Matthew is alive, oh my God. Richard, we have to find him. Robert won't stop at anything now that the truth is coming out." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He pulled out his phone and frantically dialed John Carson's number. "John, I need you to go to the orphanage right now. Make sure Alex is safe," Richard ordered urgently. But it was too late. John arrived at the orphanage only to find that Alex was missing. Mrs. Johnson was distraught, explaining that the young man had gone for a walk and hadn't returned. Meanwhile, in an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city, Robert held Alex captive. The young man, tied to a chair, looked at his captor with a mix of fear and confusion. "Why are you doing this?" Alex asked, struggling against the ropes that bound him. Robert paced nervously around the room. "You don't understand, do you? You're the key to everything. You're the only thing standing between me and the Montgomery fortune." "What are you talking about? I'm just an orphan," Alex protested. Robert let out a bitter laugh. Oh, what irony. The heir to one of the largest fortunes in the United States raised in an orphanage. You're Matthew Montgomery, Richard and Carol's son." Alex felt the world collapse beneath him. No, it can't be true. "Oh, but it is," Robert continued. "And now that your dear father is about to discover the truth, I have to take drastic measures." At the hospital, Richard helped Carol prepare to leave. Despite the doctor's insistence, Carol refused to stay a minute longer. "Our son needs us, Richard," she said with determination. "I've been separated from him for 15 years. I'm not going to lose another second." Just as they were about to leave, John Carson burst into the room, out of breath. "Mr. Montgomery, Alex has disappeared, and there's more. We found evidence in Robert's office documents proving that he orchestrated the accident, faked Mrs. Montgomery's death, and has been embezzling company funds for years." Richard felt the anger consume him. "That bastard? Where is he? Where does he have my son?" "We have a lead," John replied. "A witness saw a black car taking Alex. We traced the vehicle to an abandoned property on the outskirts of the city. Without wasting another second, Richard, Carol and John headed there, alerting the police along the way. In the abandoned house, Robert was growing. Increasingly nervous, he knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. In a desperate move, he decided to play his last card. "Listen, Alex." "Matthew," he said, approaching the young man. "I know I've made mistakes, but we can still fix this. Think about it. With your father's fortune, we could do great things, help more kids like you. You just have to cooperate with me." Alex looked at Robert with disdain. "I'll never cooperate with someone who's done so much harm to my family." At that moment, the sound of approaching sirens could be heard. Robert panicked. He pulled out a gun and pointed it at Alex. "I'm sorry, boy. You leave me no choice." Just as Robert was about to pull the trigger, the door burst open. Richard and Carol entered, followed by the police. "Alex!" Carol cried, tears in her eyes as she saw her son after so many years. "Drop the gun, Robert!" Richard ordered, positioning himself protectively in front of his family. Robert, cornered, looked frantically around. In a final act of desperation, he aimed the gun at Richard. "You forced me into this, brother. You were always the favorite, the successful one. What was there for me?" But before he could fire, Alex, who had managed to free himself from his restraints, lunged at Robert. In the struggle, the gun fell to the floor and the police seized the opportunity to subdue Robert. As Robert was handcuffed, Richard and Carol rushed to Alex. For the first time in 15 years, the Montgomery family was reunited. "My son," Carol sobbed, hugging Alex tightly. Richard enveloped them both in his arms, tears streaming down his face. "We're together now. No one will separate us again." Alex, overwhelmed by the emotions and revelations, clung to his parents. Though his mind was still, struggling to process everything that had happened, his heart knew that he had finally found his place in the world. As the police led Robert away, the Montgomery family left the house, united and determined to make up for lost time. They knew they had a long road ahead, many wounds to heal and many stories to share, but they also knew that no matter what, they would face it together. The sun set on the horizon, marking the end of a dark chapter in their lives and the beginning of a new one, full of hope and possibilities. The days following the dramatic rescue were a whirlwind of emotions for the Montgomery family. Alex, still processing the truth about his identity, moved into the family mansion where Richard and Carol worked to create a welcoming environment for their newly recovered son. The first nights were difficult. Alex had nightmares about the kidnapping and often woke up screaming. Carol, with the maternal instinct that had been repressed for 15 years, would rush to his room to comfort him. "I'm here, my love," she would whisper as she held him. "You're safe now." Richard, for his part, dealt with his own guilt. He felt responsible for not discovering the truth sooner, for trusting his brother all those years. One night, as they all dined together, Alex finally expressed the doubts that had been tormenting him. "How can I be part of this family?" he asked with a trembling voice. "I've lived my whole life as an orphan. I don't know how to be a Montgomery." Richard put down his fork and looked his son in the eye. "Alex, Matthew, you don't have to be anything more than yourself. You've made us proud from the moment we met you at the orphanage, long before we knew you were our son. Carol took Alex's hand. Your father's right. Your compassion, your desire to help others, that's what makes you a Montgomery. Not the name, not the money, but your heart. Alex felt a lump form in his throat. But what if I disappoint you? That's impossible, Richard replied firmly. The only thing that could disappoint us is if you weren't true to yourself, and we know that won't happen. Little by little, Alex began to open up. He shared stories of his life at the orphanage, his dreams of helping other children in similar situations. Richard and Carol listened attentively, marveling at the strength and kindness of their son. Meanwhile, the case against Robert advanced. The evidence was overwhelming, and he soon faced trial for attempted murder, kidnapping, and fraud. Richard, despite the pain caused by his brother's betrayal, decided to testify against him. It's the right thing to do, he told Carol one night. For you, for Matthew, for all the lives he endangered with his ambition. The day of the trial, the Montgomery family presented a united front. Alex, nervous but determined, also decided to testify. When it was his turn to take the stand, Alex looked directly at Robert. For years I believed I had no family, but even then I knew what love and loyalty meant thanks to the people at the orphanage. What you did, betraying your own family, is something I'll never understand. For the first time, Robert seemed to show remorse. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet his nephew's eyes. After weeks of testimony and deliberations, Robert was found guilty on all charges. As he was led out of the courtroom, he looked at Richard one last time. "I'm sorry, brother," he murmured. "I'm so sorry." Richard nodded slightly, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. It was the closure of a painful chapter in their lives. With the trial over, the Montgomery family could focus on healing and rebuilding their lives together. Inspired by Alex's passion, Richard and Carol decided to create a foundation to help orphaned children and families in vulnerable situations. "We want others to have the opportunity to reunite with their loved ones as we did," Carol explained at the opening gala of the Montgomery Foundation. Alex, standing between his parents, smiled with pride. For the first time in his life, he felt that he truly belonged somewhere. He was no longer just the orphan Alex or the heir Matthew Montgomery. He was both and much more. As the family embraced in front of the camera flashes, Richard whispered, "We did it. We're together." Carol, with tears of happiness in her eyes, nodded, "And nothing will ever separate us again." Alex, feeling the love and support of his parents, knew that, no matter what, they would face the future together. The tragedy that had separated them had become the bond that now united them stronger than ever. 1 year had passed since the dramatic reunion of the Montgomery family. The mansion, once cold and lonely, was now filled with life and laughter. Alex, who had decided to keep his first name but adopt the last name Montgomery, had surprisingly adapted well to his new life. It was a sunny Sunday morning when Richard found his son in the garden, surrounded by blueprints and documents. "Working on a Sunday?" Richard asked with a smile. Alex looked up, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. "Dad, I think I've found the perfect location for the new community center for the foundation." Richard sat down next to his son, examining the blueprints. "It looks promising. Why don't we discuss it with your mom over breakfast?" As they headed to the dining room, Richard couldn't help but marvel at how much his life had changed. The Montgomery Foundation, born from Alex's desire to help other children like him, had become a family project that united them even more. Carol was waiting for them in the dining room, reviewing some emails on her tablet. When she saw them enter, her face lit up. "My two favorite men," she said, kissing them both on the cheek. "What's got you so excited so early?" Alex shared his idea for the new community center, and soon the three of them were immersed in an animated discussion about how they could improve the lives of more families in need. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Moments later, Mrs. Johnson, the former orphanage director, who now worked at the Montgomery Foundation, entered the dining room with an expression of contained excitement. "Sorry for the interruption," she said, "but there's something you need to see." She handed them an envelope. Richard opened it and pulled out a letter. As he read it, his eyes widened. "It's from the Department of Justice," he said, his voice trembling. "They've reviewed Robert's case, and they've granted him the opportunity for rehabilitation and community service under strict supervision." A tense silence fell over the room. Carol was the first to break it. "What exactly does this mean?" she asked, her voice mixed with concern and a touch of hope. Richard continued reading. "It says that given his good behavior and apparent remorse, he will be allowed to work in rehabilitation programs for ex-convicts, always under supervision. And they request our approval for him to participate in some of the Montgomery Foundation's projects as part of his reintegration process." All eyes turned to Alex. The young man remained silent for a moment, processing the information. I don't know what to think," he finally admitted. "Part of me wants to give him a chance, but another part is scared." Carol took her son's hand. "That's understandable, honey. What Robert did was terrible, but if he's truly remorseful..." "Maybe this is an opportunity," Mrs. Johnson suggested. "An opportunity to heal, not just for Robert, but for the whole family." Richard looked at his wife and son, seeking guidance. "What do you think? This decision affects all of us." Carol took a deep breath. "I think we should consider it. If Robert is truly remorseful and wants to change, maybe we can be part of that change." Alex remained silent for a moment longer, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Finally, he spoke. "My whole life at the orphanage, I learned about forgiveness and second chances. I always believed in that. It would be hypocritical of me to deny it to someone in my own family, no matter how difficult it is." Richard felt a surge of pride at his son's maturity. "So, we agree to give Robert this chance." The family nodded, albeit with some apprehension. They decided that Robert would work on projects for the foundation, but under strict supervision and without direct contact with beneficiaries at first. Weeks later, the day arrived when Robert would present himself at the Montgomery Foundation offices. The tension was palpable when he entered. Escorted by a parole officer, Robert, visibly thinner and with hair streaked with grey, seemed a shadow of the arrogant man he once was. His eyes, once filled with ambition, now showed remorse and shame. "Richard, Carol, Alex," he said with a broken voice, I don't know where to begin. I'm sorry, seems insufficient for all the harm I've caused." Richard stepped forward. "Robert, it won't be easy. The trust you destroyed won't be rebuilt overnight, but we're willing to give you this chance. Don't waste it." Robert nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you. I promise I'll do everything I can to make amends." The following months were a challenge for everyone. Robert worked tirelessly at the foundation, from administrative tasks to planning new projects. Little by little, his dedication and genuine remorse began to ease the tensions. One day, while Alex was supervising the construction of the new community center, Robert approached him. "Alex," he said cautiously, "I know I'm probably the last person you want advice from, but I've been reviewing your plans and I think I have an idea that could improve the building's energy efficiency." Alex hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. "I'm listening." As Robert explained his idea, Alex was surprised to realize that it was actually a brilliant proposal. They worked together for the rest of the afternoon, and for the first time, Alex saw glimpses of the uncle he might have had. That night, during the family dinner, Alex shared what had happened. "I think Robert is really changing," he said. "Today I saw a side of him I'd never seen before." Richard and Carol exchanged looks of surprise and relief. The healing process was underway. As time passed, the Montgomery Foundation grew and expanded, touching the lives of thousands of people. Robert, having completed his supervision period, became a valuable member of the team, dedicating his intelligence and skills to noble causes instead of selfish schemes. On the 5th anniversary of the foundation, the Montgomery family organized a grand charity gala. Richard, Carol, and Alex took the stage to give a speech. 5 years ago, Richard began, Our family was broken, separated by tragedy and deceit. Today, we stand here not just as a reunited family, but as part of a much larger family that includes every person we've been able to help through this foundation, Carol continued. We've learned that forgiveness and compassion can overcome even the deepest wounds, that every person deserves a chance to redeem themselves, and that family, love, can overcome any obstacle. Alex took the microphone, his voice filled with emotion. I grew up believing I had no family. Now I know that my family is larger than I ever imagined. It includes every child in our programs, every family we've helped, and yes, even those who once harmed us but have chosen the path of redemption. From the back of the room, Robert watched with tears in his eyes, grateful for the second chance he had been given. The gala was a resounding success, raising enough funds to expand the Foundation's programs nationwide. But beyond the financial success, it represented the triumph of family love, forgiveness, and the human capacity to change and grow. That night, as the Montgomery family returned home, Richard looked around at Carol, the wife he thought he had lost, at Alex, the son he had recovered against all odds, and even at Robert, the brother who had found his way back to the family. He felt a deep gratitude for the twists and turns of fate. You know, Richard said with a smile, I think I can finally say that our story has a happy ending. Carol playfully nudged him. Oh, Richard, this isn't an ending. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. Alex nodded, his eyes shining with hope and determination. And it'll be the best chapter yet. As the car drove off into the night, carrying the Montgomery family toward their future, it was clear that their story of love, forgiveness, and redemption would continue to inspire many for years to come. Because at the heart of this family, once shattered and now stronger than ever, lay a universal truth: that love, when true and enduring, can overcome any obstacle and heal even the deepest wounds.